Welcome. I'm John Draper. I'm the Program Director for Research and Partnerships at the Stem Cell Network. And I'd like to welcome you to an introduction to early stage commercialization in regenerative medicine. So a little bit of background here about this webinar. So the regenerative medicine biosector in Canada is seeing an unprecedented surge in activity and investment. High-profile funding rounds for companies that have emerged from academic research programs, including Blue Rock and Notch, illustrate the opportunities that can arise when researchers choose to translate their discoveries. So today's webinar, which is hosted by the Stem Cell Network and the Center for Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine, is designed to provide researchers at all levels with familiarity with the concepts underpinning the commercialization process. This webinar is accompanied by a technology commercialization readiness guide, which is published on SCN's website, and I will post a link in the chat in a moment. And the webinar features two great speakers. Our first speaker, Vishan Sivagnanam, will cover the fundamentals of commercialization and the process that's required for commercializing regenerative medicine discoveries. Vishan is a commercialization manager at CCRM. He supports CCRM's company creation activity and leads strategic support for academics in the regenerative medicine space. He brings over a decade of experience in commercializing early stage discoveries. Before joining CCRM in 2018, Vishan was a business development officer for Sick Kids in the Industry Partnership and Commercialization Office. Vishan has an MSc in Neuroimmunology from the University of Toronto and an MBA in Entrepreneurship and Venture Development from the Ted Rogers School of Management. Our second speaker is Dr. Anouk Fortin, who will be discussing the role that academic technology transfer offices play, or TTOs, they play in helping researchers to navigate the complexities and obstacles that they may encounter when seeking to translate a discovery towards the market. Anouk is the head of technology transfer office at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, where she has supported research and innovation since 2005. Dr. Fortin obtained her PhD in biochemistry from McGill University and went on to work in several biotech companies, including ones that were focused on regenerative medicine, before joining OHRI Technology Transfer Office. She holds a registered technology transfer professional designation and is an active member of the provincial, national, and international technology transfer communities. And these include ORCA, CTTP, and Autumn. Some of which you may all be familiar with. Some of the success stories that Dr. Fortin has participated in include a multi-patent license to Fate Therapeutics. This was a biotech that went on to a successful NASDAQ IPO, and also Turnstone Biologics, a company founded on OHRI intellectual property, and which is on the Health Narwhal list from the University of Toronto's Impact Center. So with that, I'll just finally say that this is an interactive webinar, so please do ask questions. Both of our experts are here to answer your questions. Those questions you can ask through the Q&A function. We'll gather those questions together, and at the end of after both of our speakers have finished talking, we will go through the questions and address them. So with that, I'll hand over to Vishan. And we'll get started. Thank you, Vishan.
Thanks, John. So in terms of the outline for today's talk, we'll be talking initially about the state of the industry. I'll be touching a little bit on commercialization, what it entails, and kind of the path that you could go through in the early stages. And my colleague Anouk will be talking about TTOs and inventions as well. So this data was adapted from the ARM report. Talking about the state of the industry at a very high level. So the COVID pandemic last year impacted several industries, notably biotech, but in fact, it seems as if there's been significant financing in spite of the pandemic. And the field has actually thrived significantly since then. And also in the last decade, there's been significant growth, as John mentioned at the beginning. There's been several approvals, lots of financing, lots of interest in the space. So you can see on the left-hand side here, compared to 2020, where there was approximately $20 billion raised. Just in the first quarter of 2021, there was $14 billion, so a 35% jump from the same time last year. And also in terms of clinical trials with industry, there's been significant increases in gene therapy, cell-based therapies as well. in both 1, 2, and 3 phases. Additionally, there's been a significant breadth of cell therapy and gene therapy development. So the predominant view is that it's oncology-related indications. CAR-T, for example, was one of the first ones, and also gene therapy for oncology. So there's 641 trials in industry right now. However, over time, there have been several expansions to that in different diseases, so central nervous system, musculoskeletal, and also metabolic disorders. So there's a lot of breadth and a lot of opportunity for treating other indications with these novel modalities going forward. In terms of the last year, so it's been a record year on a different perspectives. So initially, we'll see here, Intellia achieves gene editing breakthrough with the first in vivo CRISPR therapy. This is the first in human dosing of a patient with a CRISPR therapy, and the initial data seems very interesting and promising. So we'll have to follow that closely. And then in terms of approvals, there have been several approvals as well with CAR-T and others. So CAR-T therapy for relapsed large B-cell lymphoma by Juno BMS. There was one, a BCMA-targeted CAR-T as well. And Yescarta became the first CAR-T therapy to receive approval in China, which is it's a large country for CAR-T development, and there's a lot of investment going on in that region as well. In terms of closer to home, so you may be familiar with Notch Therapeutics, which raised earlier this year $85 million US for a Series A, which was working with Allogene, a large cell therapy firm in the US, to develop off-the-shelf iPSC-derived cell therapies. And Notch was actually spun out from CCRM's launch team, which is the company creation team that I'm a part of as well. Also in 2020, so a bit earlier, Century Therapeutics bought Empirica, which was a local firm in McMaster, treating brain cancers with CAR-Ts as well. So a lot of development locally, and we hope to see more of that in the ecosystem as time goes on. And to talk about commercialization. So commercialization is the process of introducing a new product to the market. In terms of benefits for yourselves, you can have a positive impact on society by providing a solution to an unmet need that's currently not solved. You can have a practical application of your research. So take your studies and apply that to potentially treating patients in the future. Opportunities with sponsored research. So you can have companies or investors sponsor the work that you're doing within the lab, so provide additional funding outside of, for example, government grant funding that can then push those research into maybe commercial avenues down the road. If you successfully license or spin out a company based on your technology and innovations, you could perhaps get revenue. This is based on the institution's IP policies. So for example, Anouk will talk about this later on in terms of revenue share, if you do successfully commercialize a drug or a cell therapy or gene therapy. And finally, it can help to build university industrial collaborations. So you can have large-scale collaborations with pharma, for example. You can kind of build a base whereby not only your lab can benefit, but the entire institution can benefit as a whole. Here I'm providing kind of a 40,000-foot view of product development within the drug and also RM fields. So you may be familiar with this. Initially, we have discovery stage research, which occurs at the university level. And then we had a development stage. So this is where you go from in vitro to in vivo models. Typically, you have animal proof of principle studies, which are hard to fund with CIHR funds, for example, because sometimes there's not funds for translational studies, but that's changing as time goes on. This also is the stage where you can have early company incubation. So thinking about business models, thinking about ways to commercialize. And then following this stage, sorry, I should touch on this. There's a big gap here in terms of the valley of death. So not only this inability to do some of these studies within the institution, but also funding, because there is very little what's called non-dilutive funding for these translational studies. So folks like CCRM and others can provide that gap with the financing, but also with the actual doing the preclinical de-risking studies as well, in-house and also externally. So if you're able to successfully get over this gap in the valley of death, you can then pursue growth stage, which is pre-IND, moving towards clinical trials. So this is typically helped by industry, as you'll see the increase in the industry bar here. So pharma and biotech will license, or they'll co-develop with you to take your technologies to the clinical phase 1 stage, for example, and so on. And following the typical clinical approval process, you can get market adoption, and selling product and hopefully having revenues come back to your lab and yourself based upon your innovations. And then so going from the high level view to kind of minutiae a little bit, in terms of the commercialization pathway that you may encounter if you're a grad student or for your faculty. So typically, if you come up with a new idea, a new invention, you'll disclose it to your technology transfer office, which is located within your institution, and they will then conduct a technology assessment after reviewing your disclosure. So they'll look at this for kind of two main buckets, the first being patentability of your technology compared to what's been done in the field previously. And the other thing is commercial viability. So looking into the market, who are the competitors, is there actual appetite for your technology, and is there an unmet need? So would for example, a physician prescribe this over what's currently standard of care? So if the TTO determines that these criteria are met, they will typically file for patent protection if it is novel, and then they'll go through that process with you. And then following that, they'll think about startup creation or licensing. So this is kind of the commercialization pathways that they'll look to adopt for your particular technology. And Anouk will also touch on this later on, but for the RM space, typically the startup creation is preferred. The main reason being that gene therapy, cell therapy, there's a lot of infrastructure that's required. There's a lot of upfront costs that's not required, for example, a small molecule oral biologic in terms of bioreactors, scale up, vector production. And so these things are best financed through a startup creation and a seed and Series A model versus a licensing play to a pharma, but that's changing as time goes on. So through this process, there'll be a lot of product development, optimization, scale up, as I just mentioned. So a lot of money and time goes into that. And then you'll need further investment to then further propel those studies going to your pre-IND for a first in human trial. On the bottom of this figure, you'll see kind of these different bars. So this is where I've just scoped in where the different stakeholders could contribute. So obviously the inventor would help with those initial stages of the disclosure, the TTO, and helping with assessment and patentability based on what they know of the prior art and their peers. They would also help obviously with product development. So at CCRM, when we incubate a company, when we're working on a company creation idea, we will definitely try to have the inventor involved in terms of thinking through those initial product concepts and how we'll do in vivo models, for example, and the entire process, the entire way through. The green bar is the TTO. So the TTO typically, not in all cases, will they be limited to these, but they will typically, do the technology assessment. They will file for patent protection, and they will prosecute those patents until they get issuance. And they will also help to not only carve out a path of commercialization, but also pursue leads for licensing. So do a lot of biz dev conversations with pharma or biotech, or also the institution can actually create the startup themselves, either by themselves or with someone like CCRM to help fund those companies and kind of raise seed financing. And as I mentioned, also CCRM, scopes the gamut of this figure here. So we try to get involved early to help not only the TTO, but also the inventor with scoping out what the company could look like, how the technology could be de-risked, and options for getting further investment and also getting management, such as entrepreneurs in residence at that early time point. And we also help with scale up. So CCRM has significant infrastructure for vector and cell therapy production. We have a GMP facility. So we try to kind of meet all of these different buckets and help anywhere we can with getting through this path. Finally, I want to touch on where opportunities exist for commercialization in regenerative medicine. It's still in an early field, a very nascent field. There's been a lot of development, but there's still a lot of significant gaps and challenges that exist. Since this is a living therapy, this is not a drug. So anything you put into the body, the dangers are that much more increased. So safety, for example, off-target effects are significant areas of concern for future development. And so there's lots of opportunity to kind of fix these problems with these technologies. So most therapies are at early stage of development. So a lot of them are still academic, going to early phase 1, phase 2 trials. And so there are partnerships that are required for access to this infrastructure, such as bioreactors. A lot of companies are now building out their own facilities to do this themselves so they can control it better. And so if academics can get in touch with those companies earlier on, it helps them to know the path that they need to get down to the scale-up path later down the road. Higher safety concerns, again, so these living therapies. And so the solution is required to decrease the risk of tumorigenesis and off-target effects. And finally, this is an ongoing concern, they're very expensive. So the approved CAR Ts, for example, are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there's efforts across the industry to decrease manufacturing costs of cell production, viral vector production, so we can actually increase access to patients and other countries as well, developing countries, for example, as time goes on. We also do this by adopting allogeneic cell therapy methodology. So currently, a lot of them are autologous. And so if we can make off-the-shelf universal cells, then that'll help decrease those costs as well. And finally, working with government and policymakers to optimize reimbursement pathways, coming up with innovative ways of payment, for example, that will help increase access to patients. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Anouk now for the TTO segment.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I think part of this presentation is to really convey that if you've got technology in the regenerative medicine space or in any other space for that matter, one of the first resources you should access is your TTO. If you can switch to the next slide, Vishan. Thank you. TTO, which is a name that is often used, means Technology Transfer Office, but at your institution, it may be called something else. It can be the Industry Liaison Office, Innovation Support Office, the Commercialization Office, or the Office of Technology Commercialization. No matter what it's called, even though the scope of what the offices do can vary, all of them will review invention disclosure, facilitate or direct IP protection, and support or lead commercialization activities. There are several models of technology transfer offices, but most institutions will have one of these, which is either an internal office where the office is part of the institution's administration. They can have an external office, so a separate corporate entity that can either take care of the needs of one institution, of several institutions, and in some cases there's even regional or provincial entities. Or there can be on-demand services from specialized contractors in the case of smaller institutions. There's also different institutional IP policies, and this is something that you should look into. After this webinar, you should go and look and figure out what is your institution IP policy. In Canada, in the States, they're all institution-owned because of law. But in Canada, we have different models. We have institution-owned, where the institution owns the IP that's created by its employees. But in exchange from owning it, it also has a responsibility and takes on the risk of IP protection and commercialization. There can be a co-owned model where the invention are co-owned by the institution and the inventors. And in those cases, responsibility for IP protection and commercialization is negotiated. Some institution, U of T, for example, call it inventor's choice. And then there's several institutions that have an inventor-owned policy in which the inventors are responsible for protecting and commercializing their IP. But most of the time, they will also have the choice to work with their tech transfer office for help and assistance in commercializing. Next slide, please. In all cases where the institution owns the IP or leads commercialization, there's something in it for the inventors. The institution will always share a percentage of net revenues for the inventors. And by net revenues, usually it's expenses related to legal and patenting costs that will be reimbursed to the institution first. And then the rest, the profit, if you want, will be shared with inventors. And the percentage can vary by institution, but it will be specified in your policy and is usually tipped in the favor of the inventors, and it can be 30, 50, even up to 80%, depending on the institution. But there's always a share that's an incentive for the inventors to work with the institutions. Now, you can wonder what can be commercialized, what's an invention? Oftentimes we think of products as being commercialized, but that's not all. Other things that can be commercialized include skills, knowledge, methods, research material and tools, processes and services. An invention is described by law as any new and useful process, machine, software, method of use, or manufacture, composition of matter, or any improvement of these, whether or not they're patentable. Because patenting is not the only means of protecting intellectual property, even though in the case of regenerative medicine, it can be, in many fields, it can be a very important tool. Next slide, please. So we often refer or speak about invention disclosure. So when should you disclose to the technology transfer office? One thing that's very important is if you have any choice at all, you should absolutely disclose and discuss with your tech transfer office before any public disclosure. And public disclosure are the obvious things like papers, theses, posters, and talks, but also includes discussion with third parties. If you keep it secret up until you've had the discussion with the tech transfer office, it protects your ability to patent. Public disclosures can have a negative impact on the ability or the scope of protection that you can get, or the geography in which it's possible. When should you disclose? That several offices may have their own preference, but ideally you disclose as early as possible to give the offices time to assess the opportunity. But you need to have something that is a little bit more than an idea. So if you're not sure if it's an invention or a discovery, don't take the chance and disclose it. And the technology certainly does not have to be market ready. The proof of concept does not have to be made. You just have to have something that you think is worthwhile discussing, and something that is concrete enough to possibly provide support for a patent application. But you do not need to know what that is. The office will help guide you as to what stage of readiness it is. It doesn't matter if it's too early. We can always have a discussion later on once you've had a chance to further develop your technology. So what is an invention disclosure? In essence, an invention disclosure is an internal document to help the technology transfer office assess the opportunity from an intellectual property protection standpoint and from a commercialization potential perspective. Next slide. So what should be an invention disclosure? As much detail as possible to help us determine patentability and commercialization potential. So you should have a good description of the invention, what it is, how it works, what problems does it solve, how does it compare to what exists, and what its level of development. We also need to know who contributed to it, so all intellectually, physically, and financially, because there might be third-party rights that we need to assess. And we also need to make assessment regarding inventorship. You should help us by identifying the relevant literature. We're generalists, we're not experts in any field. You are the experts, it's your field. You know what's relevant, so it does help us if you give us a leg up and provide those kind of references. You should also let us know if you've discussed and what you've discussed, and when you've discussed it, any type of possible disclosure. Sometimes abstracts can have been presented without jeopardizing patentability, but it will be important for us to know that you did, let's say, present that abstract so that we can assess the possible impact. And you should also let us know who you think the possible users or companies or that could be receptors or the competitors could be. If you want a bit of help in gathering the information or knowing what information is important to put in those invention disclosures. The Stem Cell Network and CCRM have developed a couple of documents that are available on the website, which is there, and I believe John also put in the chat or will put in the chat. And I invite you to take a look at those documents because the more informed the disclosure is, the more productive the discussion is with the Tech Transfer Office. So this is one of the documents, and if you go to the next slide, there's another document which is a little case study. So that can give you an idea of the type of information you should put together and the type of things you need to think about. It's also helpful in a case where you should be the one commercializing the invention. In some cases, the Technology Transfer Office is not responsible for commercializing. In the cases where it's an inventor-owned policy or for some reason the inventor has been licensed or assigned the invention, these are the types of question and information that you will need to gather in order to make your business case. But when you work with Technology Transfer Office, we help you. You do not have to have all the answers. These are just to help you understand what type of thing we're looking for, what type of questions we will be asking. So don't be put off by the fact that you may not have all the answers. That's what we're here for. We're here for to help you. Now, what do we do with the invention disclosure? We review them to assess patentability and commercialization potential. It's okay, you can go to the next slide. As far as the technology is concerned, the type of questions that we ask and what we're seeking to understand is what unmet need does the technology address? What are its advantage or benefits? Commercial advantage is big. It's important to understand. Is it a one-trick pony or a platform technology? So can you develop one or more product from it? What's the stage of development? How much more research and development is required before you can get a market to product? Are there any technical barriers to commercialization? And these can be somebody else that has a patent that can block you or that is necessary for, let's say, the manufacturing. We also need to assess the potential patients or customers that would benefit from the technology and determine if IP protection can be secured. And although patent is an important mean, it's not the only mean. There's other IP protection that is possible, such as copyright, trademarks, and trade secrets. From a patentability perspective, what is patentable? Not everything is patentable, so we need to determine whether or not it's patentable. And the law will say an invention needs to be new, non-obvious, or useful. And the non-obvious one is something that scientists have a hard time accepting. For them, everything is non-obvious. What you have to think of non-obvious, change the word to unexpected. That is a lot more palatable to scientists in my experience. And then we have to determine whether or not it's the subject matter is patentable. For example, life forms and ideas are not something that's patentable. We will conduct prior art review of both publication literature, scientific literature, and patents. We will look at it and provide opinion on the scope of protection. So a patent is a monopoly, so it's a right to exclude others from doing something. So you want to make sure that it's as broad as possible, but of course you will not be granted a patent to anything and everything under the sun, only to what you've been able to demonstrate is works. Sometimes it can be very narrow, or it can be easy for others to bypass. So these are the type of information that we assess. We'll look at public disclosures because if your invention has been disclosed in the public, it can limit where or if we can patent. We will also take into account important deadlines. So if you have presentation or publications upcoming that may narrow the window of protection or the window we have to seek protection, we will take this into account, always trying to make sure that we don't delay or prevent you from publishing, because that's your main bread and butter as scientists. We will also assess what type of support you have. So by this, I mean results. Do you have already results? Do you have figures, tables, anything that can help, that can be put into a patent application? And we will assess or help you determine who's an inventor, which is not something that is decided arbitrarily. It's a concept that's defined by law. And we will also determine who owns the IP based on who contributed, who's an inventor, and the respective policies that are applicable. As far as commercialization assessment, we wonder if there are, well, who is the owner and if there's any third-party rights. Sometimes you will have funding or partnerships that will come with strings attached, and we need to figure that out. Is there freedom to operate? So freedom to operate is when you do not have freedom to operate when you need somebody else's IP or right to somebody else's patent in order to exercise your own. So they can be different invention, but let's say, for example, you have an improvements to something are patentable, but if you don't have the rights to what you improved, you may not be able to exercise or to commercialize your improvement. We will look at market analysis, so the size, the growth rate. We will look at the competition and the competitive advantage of your technology. The users, the potential receptors. There can be a difference in strategy if a user is, let's say, a doctor as opposed to a company. Is IP protection possible? And if so, what could be a good strategy for it? Also, what kind of time and investment would be required in order for your technology to reach the market? And once we've looked at all of that, we will identify and put together possible commercialization strategy or strategies. One thing to consider with regenerative medicine is that the commercialization path is often very different than what it would be for a therapeutic, a pill, if you want, and a biologic. In the case of a pill or a biologic, you will see on that gray shaded area on top here, there's few stakeholders involved and communication is pretty straightforward. But in the case of regenerative medicine, especially, cell and gene therapy, there's many actors involved and many communication points and stakeholders. So in order to get a product to patients, there needs to be lots of party involved, from the doctor to the payers to the sourcing of a material, the production of the material, and the delivery of the material. So it's somewhat a different beast, if you want, in terms of commercialization path and strategy. There's also different business models. So the companies that are in the business of cell and gene therapy are structured or have different consideration than those that are involved in sort of regular small molecule therapeutics. And I don't want you to focus on what's written in the purple arrows here, but just to notice under all those different headers, the difference between the therapeutics, the biologics, and the gene therapy. There will be difference in reimbursement consideration. There will be a difference in marketing and how you distribute it, in the delivery, who delivers and how it's delivered. Of course, in distribution, a pill can be distributed in the pharmacy, whereas cell therapeutic, needs to be there at the hospital. Manufacturing is a big one. There's no, for cell and gene therapy, it has to be manufactured on demand or in limited quantities because we're talking about a living organism, and it's very different than those that can be chemically synthesized. The regulatory environment is also different, and the path to obtain regulatory approval is different. And the clinical trials will also be different. So the development, so a large number of trials versus small groups of patients, depending on your indication. So with all this in mind, when we're considering commercializing, oftentimes in academic tech transfer, licensing is often the method of choice to commercialize our intellectual property. Licensing is ideal when you have a very well-defined IP and established receptors, when you can take it and deliver it to the receptor, and then they can just take it and finish the R&D and put it in the market. Oftentimes with regenerative medicine, there's no good receptors that are already established. That doesn't mean that it's not a great opportunity and that it shouldn't be pursued. It just means that we have to pivot and use a different mechanism, and that's where spin-offs are really interesting. So spin-offs are really ideal, a commercialization mechanism for inventions that have high uncertainty, which or don't have a lot of good receptors. It's also a good way of ensuring inventor involvement and for transferring tacit knowledge. So that's know-how, processes, things that are not necessarily patented, but are really vital in the commercialization of the technology. And in the case of regenerative medicine, this is particularly true, that a lot of value from how you do something, how you manufacture something, there's an art to it, and this needs to be transferred in order to have successful commercialization. So that's why spin-offs are oftentimes a preferred means of commercializing those types of technologies. Now, what does the TTO do in terms of commercializing? We identify or develop commercialization strategy, so spin-off, licensing, or to whom. We help develop and disseminate marketing material, so you don't necessarily have to yourself go and interact with possible licensee. We will do that. We will provide entrepreneurial and education support and information. We will negotiate the agreements, so you do not need to be a lawyer or to be well-versed into the nitty-gritty of what licensing agreements are. And we will make you benefit from our network, and this includes investors, experts, entrepreneur, and the good folks of institution and organization like CCRM, which are part of our network and are part of your network and are there to assist in the commercialization of technologies. Now, if we're to recap how the process goes of working with your technology transfer office, it starts with you that makes an invention or a discovery that of something, or you've identified something in your research that you think has commercialization potential. The first thing you should do is notify the tech transfer office, and we will then ask you to oftentimes discuss with us and fill out an invention disclosure form, which will either work with you to complete or review after the fact, and we can ask, it's a living document. So we will work together to make sure that it contains all the information that we need in order for us to do our market and patentability assessment. Based on these, and to help us in those market and patentability assessment, you can conduct the commercialization self-assessment that's available in the Stem Cell Network website. Based on all this information, we will decide whether or not we will proceed with patenting or protecting the IP and commercialization. Should we decide not to proceed, in most cases, institution will give you the option to request to have the rights to the invention back in the case of institution that own the invention. If we decide to proceed, then we will work with you to file a patent application. Inventor involvement is absolutely essential because you're the one that has the information, but we're not going to leave you alone with patent agents. We will work in structuring the disclosure that we will provide the patent agents to, which can be internal or external. Most of the time they will be external, and to make sure that they have a good grasp of what the invention is and what can go in the patent application. We will handle the patent filing, the patent prosecution, and all of that. Here we have identify path to market. Well, technically the path to market will probably have been identified at the time of decision to proceed, but we will certainly implement it. So we will either advertise or negotiate licensing for the invention, or we will assist in company creation. And the level of assistance can vary by institution, but in all cases, the goal is to help you, facilitate you, and provide you with our network expertise and all the resources that you need in order to succeed with this. And on this, I think we're both ready to take questions. I don't know if, John, you want to help us identifying the questions?
Yeah, I will start fielding the questions for you. So we've got some questions coming into the Q&A, so please type them in. And the very first question that we have, is it better to contact the TTO before publishing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You really should. Publishing is a public disclosure. So if you put your invention in the public domain, it can prevent the ability to patent. So in Canada and the United States, there's a grace period for the inventors. If they themselves have disclosed, there's still a possibility to patent in North America to a certain degree, but you've basically lost the ability to seek a patent in the rest of the world. At worst, you can contact us when you've submitted, because as you know, it's not because you've submitted today that your paper is going to be accepted tomorrow. There's usually a certain delay, so there's a window of opportunity there, but certainly I would advise no later than after you've submitted or that you've put together your paper.
I think this links to the next question. What if I've presented a poster of my research at a conference? Is it all over essentially? You know, can I continue on and actually try and commercialize the content that was in there?
See, there's ways of presenting posters and abstracts without giving the secret sauce away. This is something that I know I do at my office. I don't know if all the offices do. I do have a science background, and I've published myself, so I'm well versed in those things. And I often do review abstracts and provide suggestions on how not to give it away. And devil's in the details. So basically, we call this an enabling disclosures. So if you do not give the essential details of how your invention works, there's still possibility of patenting. Even if you gave some details away, what it may impact is what you can patent. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't patent at all. It's just we may have to pivot or go a little bit narrower in the scope that we can protect, but it may be too late. You never know, but there's ways of mitigating the impact of disclosures. So that's why it's important to disclose what it is you presented, when you presented it, And if you get a chance, you can involve your tech transfer office before you submit abstracts and posters so that they can advise you to minimize the consequences.
Okay, fantastic. So here's a question. How do you protect your idea when writing grants?
Grants, okay. So the perspective on grants will vary by the risk comfort level of your TTO. So if you talk to a patent agent will tell you to consider that grants are public disclosures, because I'm sure you've heard of a grant application being shared between scientists, even though they're not supposed to. So grant applications are supposed to be confidential. So you can, most of the time, you can assume that the grants are supposed to be confidential. That being said, you have to be very careful about the abstract. Oftentimes when you do get awarded a grant, the granting institution will put an abstract on the website, and that is a public disclosure. So you have to particularly be careful of what you write in that abstract. And again, if you need ideas or advice, your tech transfer office should be able to help you mitigate the possible consequences.
Okay, there's one here for you, Vishaan, I think that you can answer. Do you need a business background to successfully commercialize?
No, you do not. As mentioned, there are lots of experts. The TTO office, has people with business and science backgrounds that can help you with those decisions. So I greatly encourage you to talk to your TTO and talk to them. There are also others in your local ecosystem. I know Canada has a expanding entrepreneurial culture that we're trying to foster. So talk to your local network and talk to your TTO first and foremost.
Okay. Maybe also you can field this one. When should regulatory requirements be considered when seeking to commercialize?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I was at the TTO office in my previous life, we didn't really look at regulatory because it's so far in the distance. But upon coming to CCRM, you really realize that there is an initial look you should have. So for example, the regulators will classify your technologies depending on what it is. And so it's also helpful to talk to experts at a very high level about what implications you could have as time goes on. So here at CCRM, we have regulatory experts. We have two people who help me with advising academics. And so if you have a question, be more than happy to kind of talk to you and provide some feedback based on your technology at a very high level in regulatory.
Okay. We have another question here. How do TTO policies and regulations work for international collaborators? Do the TTO policies of each country apply, or is it usually one country's TTO?
So policies will apply to individuals, whether it's within the country, within the province, or internationally. So people will each be bound by their own institution's policy. So normally when we have many people involved, the institutions will first determine, okay, what policies apply. And when there's more than one institution involved, we will put together interinstitutional agreements in place. So basically the institution determines amongst themselves who will take the lead, how we will share revenues, and those types of things. Individuals should not be themselves subject to more than one policy if things are done right. Sometimes there's gaps in policies, or it can be not clear which policies applies to you. But if things are done right, you should not be subject to more than one policy.
I think this is maybe for both of you. What advice do you have for PhD students to best prepare for spinning off their work? Focus solely on enabling the science, or versus seeking operator experiences, TTO internships? Anouk, do you want to go first? And then Vishaan, maybe you.
I'll let Vishaan go if he's got.
So my advice is always, I think, talk to the TTO. I think I keep repeating that. Talk to the TTO. They're going to be your best friends in terms of those early steps, because it is those early steps that are most crucial. Public disclosure is a danger that you need to look out for. Talking to the right people initially, IP strategy, also startup or licensing. So your TTO is best fit for those discussions. I think that's probably where, depending on your individual situation, they can help lead you to other experts that you would need.
Okay.
Yes. I would say the more information you can gather, the more knowledge you have in terms of your technology, what it is, its competitive advantage, those kinds of things will be. So as a PhD student, as somebody involved in the development of the technology, you will be the best person to sell it. You are the one that knows the advantage. You are the one that knows the limitation. You have intimate knowledge on how it works, how the possible obstacles will be in the manufacturing, or you may be the one that has a network of people that are in the field, that could be relationships with receptors. So you can gather all this information. Certainly the documents that the Stem Cell Network has on its website is a good source of things to think about, what you need to consider. In terms of experience in commercialization, that's always something that can be acquired later on, or from your network, or that can be, you can get a partner that has the business experience. Oftentimes it's difficult for one person to be it all. The most successful companies usually have teams to support the development of the company, and you're not expected to know it all. But we are certainly resources and have network where we can help you gather all the information, the tools, and the knowledge that you need in order to be successful in spinning out your company. There's lots of internships, programs, incubators. There's lots of resources available, particularly to students, and usually we're aware of those, and we'd be happy to convey all the knowledge we have on that to try and help you be successful.
Thank you. We have a question here. I think I heard Vishan mention that CCRM provides non-dilutive funding. Can you expand on that?
Sorry, we don't provide non-dilutive funding per se, but depending on the technology. So we look at hundreds of technologies each year for our technology sourcing, and those technologies go through kind of a gated stepwise process. And depending on where they get in the process, they get to a level where we form an incubation team within CCRM. And those company concepts can get funding from within CCRM, but we'll also look to try and raise either non-dilutive funding through grants or through investors. We'll try and raise risk capital. So we don't have a funding competition per se, but depending on if your technology, if we see it, if it goes through our process and it makes it to that point, then there's an opportunity to kind of raise both types of funding to push that technology forward. But if you want to know more, please get in touch and happy to discuss.
Fantastic. Can I still patent my discovery if it uses technology protected by someone else's IP? For example, maybe a cell and gene therapy that requires CRISPR-based genetic modification in its production.
Yeah, so that will possibly be an issue of freedom to operate. So let's say that the CRISPR technology is patented. You can have sort of an improvement or something that uses the CRISPR, and that in itself may be patentable, but in order to commercialize it, you would need to have the right to use the CRISPR technology to do so.
Okay. There are many, this is another question here, there are many ideas that were rejected by TTOs, but later commercialized with huge profits. Why is this the case?
I would say the simple answer to this is that we don't have a crystal ball. I wish we did. The reality is that every institution has a limited budget for technology transfer, and we can't pursue every opportunity. So there's always a decision that needs to be made. In my practice, if something comes up and the decision is made not to pursue patenting and commercialization, I'll always have a discussion with the inventors and try to tell them why we made that decision and provide them with an opportunity to tell me I was wrong. I'm happy to be wrong when I make those, and sometimes I just misunderstood what the invention was or misunderstood the context, and I have no misplaced pride in being told that I'm wrong. That being said, sometimes we just decide not to pursue it, and then I guess we have to live with the consequences of our decisions. But normally a good tech transfer office will have a mechanism where they can return opportunities or put them pending. If it's too early, say, come back and talk to me in 6 months. I have a case where I worked with inventors for probably 3 years before the invention disclosure was ready to pursue. But I never stopped talking to them. And it's not because I didn't really say no, I just said not now. So that's good practice, but I can't say that everybody adopts those practices. It depends on many factors.
Okay, I think we've got maybe time for one last question. What about the standard for record keeping? If you're thinking of protecting discoveries, how do you do that? What's the best practices, lab books, etc.? Yes.
The issue of lab books where you needed a signature, and so that was a bit, it's a bit in the past, in the sense that several years ago in the US in particular, which is of course a very important market, so most people will seek to patent in the States, it was a first to invent mechanism. So if you could demonstrate that you've invented something first, and how you demonstrated that was through signed records, so lab books where you signed off on, then you could kind of seek a patent even though somebody else may have. Now that system has changed, and it's now a first to patent. So it doesn't matter if you've invented it first, as long as you are the first one that sought a patent for it. Mm-hmm. So the requirements from that perspective have changed. They're not as stringent. That being said, it's good science, it's good practice to have good record keeping, so that what's the most important in patents as in science is that somebody else will be able to reproduce your work. So a patent is a monopoly granted by government in exchange for an enabling disclosure, which means that patents are published, it's on a website. And the idea is that it's open for public review so that people can look and can reproduce your invention and build on them. And patents will require a certain level of disclosure, so they do not need to have, it won't be peer reviewed, so you do not need the same quality or quantity of data that you would need for a paper. N of 3 works for patents, whereas you might be ashamed to try and publish something that has an N of 3, but it still requires to be really well documented.
All right, there's one final question. Maybe you can do this very quickly. Does a private presentation among academics qualify as a disclosure of prior art?
If it's internal to your institution, no.
Okay.
If it includes external people, there's a risk. How to mitigate that risk? If there are people that you know really well, you can tell them that it's confidential, or you can ask them to have a confidential agreement put in place before the presentation. Not very often have those led to consequences, but if you ask somebody that's really by the book, if it includes people from different institutions, it will be considered in public disclosure.
Well, fantastic. Both of you, thank you very much for your time. I'll remind all of the people who are tuned in that you can get more information about both the Stem Cell Network and CCRM from our respective websites. We have social media handles that you can go and connect to through our websites as well. And thank you again. Good afternoon.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.